Thank you very much. I will try to put in the short time we have for the presentation a little bit of a few ideas in order to be able to, in a way, help focus on an approach based on sustainable development to crime prevention and treatment of offenders. And in a way, I also want to bring the experience of the most unequal and the most violent region in the world, which is Latin America, and all the challenges that we had faced in the last decade related with crime and violence. I would like to start saying that, of course, violence and criminal behavior have a negative impact on many dimensions of the lives of citizens and families, and has always been considered an obstacle to the sustainable development of communities, of institutions and societies as a whole. It affects not only our life expectancy, our GDP, our public budgetary allocations, but also our everyday lives and routines, our social cohesion, and our public spaces. And also erodes people's confidence on the state and generates wide support for negative repressive measures. All societies have generated complex security, law enforcement, and justice mechanisms to protect law-abiding citizens from deviated conduct and from fear of becoming a victim of crime. And within these response systems, both repressive and preventive measures have been considered and implemented in order to reduce levels of violence and crime. On the one side, repressive measures have been usually applied as a reactive and retributory strategy to generate both deterrence and inhibition of criminal behavior by fear of the consequences, as well as discipline and punishment as a response to the wrong being committed. Something that is already being pointed at over here is the fact that crime rates and public levels of concern about crime and politicians' perceptions of both these factors are important determinants of penal policy. Social imaginaries based on fear and disgust over crime-related individuals, populations, and even areas keep favoring punitive and ineffective measures mainly based on confinement and punishment, not offering many pathways for rehabilitation and social reintegration, feeding again a never-ending cycle of relapse and reoffending and intergenerational transmission of violence, social exclusion, inequality, and poverty. This radical and incomplete framework of responses from the coercive side has, in many jurisdictions, generated a unique menu composed by police action, arrest, and judicialization, extended periods of pretrial detention, and long and sometimes disproportionate prison terms and other penalties. Penal policies are not becoming harsher everywhere, but there is an emphasis in some jurisdictions of being tough on crime. Zero tolerance policies have been installed in these jurisdictions, justifying the use of excessive force and levels of lethal violence, with little consideration for human rights and resulting in further strengthening of criminal networks, serious human rights violations, particularly against youth and minors, and abuse of authority and congestions of already overcrowded prisons. Many professionals and scholars believe and also generated evidence that the use of imprisonment should be avoided to the extent possible, and that punishments should be moderate, restrained, proportionate, and respectful of offenders' human rights. On the contrary, what happens in practice is that its use is overwhelming. In many countries, the arbitrary and illegal application of pretrial detention is a chronic problem, instead of being considered an exceptional measure by nature, a measure by legality, necessity, and proportionality. Moreover, prisons in many countries are affected by overpopulation and harsh living conditions, with specific threats to the life, dignity, personal safety, proper nutrition, physical and mental health, access to legal protection, and other basic human rights of many inmates. Diversion programs, alternatives to incarceration, and restorative justice measures are only promising paths with very limited development and investment in most countries and in the local jurisdictions. And this has a direct and dramatic impact on development results. This tougher approaches not only have failed to achieve the objective of reducing the levels of violence and crime, but also have been detrimental of human security, sustainable development, democratic governance, and human rights. They have also generated considerable strain to public budgets, and they are responsible also for the sluggishness of the criminal justice system, the erosion of its legitimacy. A slow justice is a non-functioning justice, the overpopulation of prisons, and the deterioration of the living conditions within penitentiary institutions. And for many years, these impacts on sustainable development have been mostly disregarded as many systems became tougher, prioritizing force, and relying on evaluations only that look at numbers of people processed through the system and official crime incidence indicators. For example, there is many times no consideration of what is the direct impact of the incarceration of a parent in the transgenerational transmission of conduct problems and delinquency, along with other problems. Also, the impact of incarceration on public health is appalling in many countries. And of course, it has stretched the social economic fabric of communities, contributing to diminished educational opportunities, fractured family structures, stagnated economic mobility, limited housing options, and restricted access to essential social entitlements, and reduced neighborhood cohesiveness. This tough on the weak approach has also been complemented by, in a way, the incapacity of many criminal justice systems in order to deal with corporate and public corruption, tax evasion, international organized crime, and money laundering. In the case of Latin America, for example, which is the most violent region and one that suffered the most the negative effects of the war on drugs, the amount of capital that illicitly flows out of this part of the world amounts for at least 150 billion per year, or 14 times more than the official development aid that comes into the region. It all sums in a tough on the weak and weak on the tough approach that has deteriorated the social contract and increased inequality in many jurisdictions. I need a slides presentation. Anyway, I will continue in terms of. So in a way, it all connects us also with the discussion of what can we do within the difficult art of prevention. And prevention and preventive interventions require a more complex response. They require sound information, research and analysis on drivers of violence and crime within a specific context, a multi-stakeholder intersectional interventions, as it was said here before, and careful planning to reduce risks and to promote protection factors by targeting diverse underlying structural causes. They also require strong articulation and political will, and usually a longer-term approach and investment that does not combine very well with the electoral need of the decision makers to show quick results to their constituents. This response from the hard hand and the soft hand of the state must evolve towards an intelligent hand linked to human development results. Such a strategy requires action that provides effective security for all, with freedom, equity, and respect for individual guarantees. Effective security means reducing crime rates and reducing the risk of being victim of a crime. And security with freedom implies that protection of all citizens leads to the absence of fear and that everyone can develop fully their capacity. The alleged perpetrators of crime must also be free of abuses to their rights, the same ones that must be protected in their entirety in case they are subject to process and legal sentence. Finally, security with equity is the universal protection to all citizens and not only to those who can afford it. Yesterday in the dialogue we had in Doitun with some of the elders, there was an underlying idea that came to my mind that of course it's a reality that none of the results that we saw yesterday in Doitun would have been possible if people would have been criminalized at the beginning of the process because of their participation in illicit economies. They were committing crimes regarding the legal framework, but the response was a response of support, was a response of care, and not a response of incarceration. As a result, the area has generated a peaceful environment, has stabilized, has prevented crime, and has prevented the dependence of these communities from illicit economies, and of course has pushed for the sustainable development. And prevention works. Preventive interventions, especially community and social crime prevention, which have traditionally been less considered and funded, have shown and have shown scientific evidence that absolutely work. WHO, UNODC, UNDP are some of the international agencies that identify some of the best bias strategies regarding crime prevention that help decrease the likelihood of individuals perpetrating violence and becoming a victim. Developing safe and stable nurturing relationships between children and their parents, developing life skills in children and adolescents, reducing the availability and harmful use of alcohol, access to guns and knives, promoting gender equality to prevent violence against women, changing cultural and social norms that support violence, and victim identification, care, and support programs. The fact that it works over mid-term or long-term periods misguides many decision makers to think that this is not an urgent issue. These actions require a multidisciplinary social response and not easy to implement, supervise, and evaluate, and are often the first to be cut from budgets due to their alleged high costs, especially if it requires investing in and caring for and offering real livelihood and alternatives to those socially and economically excluded and stigmatized because of their poverty and their permanent relationship with justice and prison systems. Nevertheless, evidence shows that crime prevention is less costly economically and socially and more effective over the long term. For example, as a crime reduction strategy, education for youth at risk or training parents is 7 times less costly than imprisonment. And of course, support once people leave prison or while in probation or parole is scarce, added to the weight of dealing with a criminal record that in most cases makes job or social reinsertion almost impossible and in practice makes a minor crime into a heavy life sentence. Somebody was talking here about the social enterprises and also the role of the private sector in really helping with those economic tools to facilitate this rehabilitation and reintegration process. I think, and I clearly think that social enterprises can compete, though ITUC has also shown that it is possible. But this added value needs to be also acknowledged by the state, not only through legislation, that it's been said also, but also through public policy and also through access to public procurement processes that might acknowledge this added value that social enterprises might produce in this kind of environments. I think I don't have much time. I was asked to generate some references for sustainable development approach to crime prevention and the treatment of offenders. The ones I bring here in this talk had to do with how to actually this problem has been approached from a different perspective, taking into consideration many of these development elements. The first reference I bring to the table is the Global Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development, because it is a global consensus on development, which is very complex. It has 17 goals and 169 targets, and the whole world agreed upon it. And what we've seen is these policies related to criminal justice, these policies related with drug control, do have an impact, a real impact on these sustainable development goals, on the capacity of many communities to reach these goals, on many territories to reach these goals, and of many countries to get to 2030 with all the warranties on helping also the most in need, which is one of the main, if not the main, value behind the 2030 agenda, is targeting those behind. And of course, when you see the people touched by the criminal justice system and the people in need, in most need, that has been targeted by the 2030 agenda, there's a very direct overlapping. And this slide some of the indicators, some of the objectives of the 2030 agenda directly deal with peace, justice, and safety objectives. The goal 16 recognizes that reducing conflict, crime, violence, and discrimination are key elements of people's well-being. Goal 11 also explicitly highlights the promotion of safe, inclusive, and resilient cities, which is an element of security associated. But the important part, and other than the partnerships which have also been highlighted here, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their targets are integrated and indivisible and have to be understood and interpreted in a comprehensive way, focusing on the integrated pillars of sustainable development, which include the economic, the social, and the environmental. I think the experience that we saw yesterday in Doitun is a living proof of the integration of all these elements. And under this light, goal 16 is not just a valuable and important aspiration on its own right, but also an enabling goal for the entire Sustainable Development Agenda. This goal embraces the core elements of a social contract between state and society, and it seeks to ensure that a match between people's expectations of what the state and other actors will deliver. As a consequence, and I think we have to be very clear on this, development agencies, as well as other sectors involved in sustainable development at international, national, and local level, social sector, education, health, labor, cultural and sport, youth, environment, private sector, and academia, cannot continue to avoid criminal justice and security issues. It's been said also here by some of the fellows. Structural causes and consequences of the development and persistence of violence and crime problems need to be fully understood and incorporated in sustainable development thinking, problem solving, planning and programming, and leaving law enforcement and criminal justice issues exclusively in the hands of security and justice operators, abandoning many of those left behind to their luck. I think it would be an exercise of irresponsibility from those sectors and stakeholders that must have a leading role of building comprehensive and effective solutions. There is many more important references for the construction of a sustainable development-led approach to crime prevention and treatment of offenders. There's a human development-based citizen security concept, which is a concept also developed conceptually in Latin America as a response to many years of dictatorship in the region and the coming of our democracies in Latin America, and also the contrast between state security and human security. It's a security based on the people, it's based on the citizens, and actually what in essence it says is that protection from crimes therefore becomes an essential component of citizenship, not as a moral claim but also as a legal obligation of the state, which should have important implications regarding security policy and programs. That's why citizen security focuses on some of the main threats which have a direct and negative impact on human development. Street crime, violence and street crime exercised against and by young people, gender violence, corruption, illegal violence by state agents, and organized crime. So that's another very important reference for this approach. The international community has already developed also guidelines and agreements on crime prevention, on treatment of offenders, and alternatives to incarceration. These UN guidelines, for example, of urban crime prevention, of prevention of crime, of course the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the Nelson Mandela rules, the Bangkok rules, which we talked about, and there's also important references coming from the development of restorative justice, mediation within the justice system, the public health approaches to crime prevention and to drug policy, which I think are very important and have been applied also by some countries and by some cities like Cali in Colombia, which actually include the scientific method in studying what are the key factors behind the involvement of people in crime. And of course, yesterday we saw a living example of how sustainable alternative development, livelihood development works in Doitun. And I would very briefly put forward the main elements that I think are the basis for success of this approach, which starts by non-criminalization, which is something that is absolutely important. The adequate sequencing that assures income generation and health to be the top priorities, which in Doitun showed to be absolutely clear. A multidimensional approach that in this case was assured from the beginning, and the fact that drug policy objectives where they took a place in the backseat of the car, and the sustainable development objectives took the top priorities in order to support people. I had some cases related to Latin American experience that could be interesting. I'll be open to share it with you. I will bring just a little note on some penal reform in Costa Rica that has started to have a real impact from the legal framework on the lives of especially women, incarcerated women, and in this case related with drug crimes. This legal reform has reduced the term and the sentences of these women, taking into account their vulnerable conditions, and it has helped also with the overcrowding of prisons. It also is complemented by a support program after they leave prison, and it has also been complemented by another legal reform that actually helps to erase the criminal record for those vulnerable people that go through prison in a fantastic way in order to allow for this economic and social reintegration of people living in prison. I will leave it here. No time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your introductory speech. Probably many people would like to ask you many questions, but I will keep the time later. So then, I'd like to invite Mr. Tan to deliver his presentation.
Good morning to everyone. His Excellency Mr. Visit, Permanent Secretary of Justice of Thailand, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. May I just take a very quick moment here to just express my gratitude on behalf of the ASEAN Secretariat to the TIJ as well as UNODC for extending an invitation to the ASEAN Secretariat to share with you on the ASEAN initiative on the culture of prevention at this colloquium. The ASEAN Declaration on the Culture of Prevention for a Peaceful, Inclusive, Resilient, Healthy and Harmonious Society is adopted by the ASEAN leaders at the ASEAN Summit last year in November. We have had the privilege to work with various UN agencies as well as with TIJ as we formulate the Culture of Prevention initiative. Well, the idea for the Culture of Prevention begins with the fundamental questions on how we can do things differently in making the region a better place where the situations of vulnerabilities and violence are being prevented. So what are we preventing? I think we have heard much from various speakers today, as well as from the Royal Highness, and in particular also from the Assistant Ministers to the Prime Minister 2 evenings ago with regards to the importance of prevention. So what are we preventing here as we develop this Culture of Prevention initiative at ASEAN? We are seeking to prevent violent extremism and other forms of violence from happening in the first place by addressing the root causes. And the other forms of violence which I refer to here would include violence against women, children, youth, vulnerable groups, and also extends to violence against the environment as a result of slow onslaught of environmental degradation, human-induced and natural disasters, and also to the extent of deprivation of mental and physical well-being, and also violence against institutional integrity as a result of bad governance and corruption, among others. So what are the root causes? I think that many speakers would understand that there are many interrelated root causes that include poverty, inequality, disparity, marginalization, social exclusion, racial and religious discriminations, sense of social injustice, lack of access to education, lack of access to employment opportunities. And I think that I would like to also allude to what the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister of Thailand said 2 evenings ago, when he said that no person is a bad person if they are given the right opportunities. And I think this is exactly the point here, that there is a need to really understand the root causes, and such root causes would include limited access or no access to education, to employment, and economic opportunities. And these causes, more often than not, are interrelated to the extent that one has to really study how each of these root cause impact on the other before to really understand how to actually address these root causes before they fester into violent extremism or other forms of violence. So why are we taking a preventive approach? We are doing this because prevention is costly and more sustainable way of doing things as compared with consequences, managing the consequences downstream. And I think that as what Dr. Kittipon has said this morning as well, is an issue of having to prevent rather than trying to respond to the situations of violence and vulnerabilities. And also, if you look at it, if you go downstream and most of the time, as you try to manage the consequences, you will find that it's more costly and less sustainable as well, because you might be trapped in a situation where you are under the strain of depleting resources to be able to actually support the system. I would say that the Doi Tong project that we actually witnessed yesterday is a case in point that well exemplified an upstream measure, a preventive measure that I think where it puts the people at the center, which is also in line with the aspirations of the ASEAN Community Vision 2025, which is really about people-oriented, people-centered community. And one point that I would like to make here is that the Doi Tong project that we saw yesterday took a very holistic approach of trying to address social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. And this is what we aspire to do with our culture of prevention initiatives going forward. Now let me just move on very quickly to just share with you the focus of the culture of prevention. If you look at what I've mentioned there, understanding the root causes, I think this is key. I think for the longest time, perhaps that's where I think the role of the academia comes in, where they could help us to better identify and understand the root causes. And it's really about framing the questions, because the way we frame the questions will shape the way we see the solutions. So, for example, much has been talked about poverty eradication. How is poverty being eradicated? But I think the question has to go upstream. We should be asking the question: how is poverty being replicated? How is it being reproduced? Because if you are able to answer questions like that, rather than going downstream, looking at poverty eradication, I think we will come a long way in trying to not just foster this culture of prevention, but truly understanding the root causes. So for us, the ASEAN Initiative on Culture of Prevention is really also a paradigm shift on the way that we try to do things. In particular, it's about adopting a mindset change from a reactive to a preventive approach. And the other emphasis is really on inculcating shared values, as you can see there: peace, harmony, intercultural understanding, the rule of law, good governance, etc. And I think that this is really important, that we have to emphasize on value-based education in schools. The visit to the correctional prison in Chiang has left a very deep impression on me. I mean, for those of us who were there, you have seen the Happy Center, you have seen the professors from the universities coming in to teach the inmates about occupational therapy in terms of preparing them mentally for the outside world. If you think about it, the upstream measure of that would be that we should be replicating the Happy Center and getting value-based education from a very young age, from primary school or secondary schools, rather than wait for when they start to commit crimes and then when they're incarcerated, then you start talking about values. I think the values have to start young. And the last but not least is that with the understanding of the root causes, our aim here is really to translate those understanding of root causes into effective upstream measures and policies. So let me just very quickly run through with you on the 6 thrusts of our declarations. Given the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all. I'm just going to highlight in particular promoting a culture of respect for all and promoting a culture of good governance at all levels. But this is just to give you a flavor of the 6 strategic thrusts under the Culture of Prevention Declaration. I'm actually from the Culture and Information Division that looks at regional cooperation in arts and culture as well as an information and media sector. But I have to say that which may not be, there are still 3 common strands that run through these 6 thrusts here. So the first point I would like to make here is that prevention itself has to start from empowering the people with the right and adequate information. And one of the important and strategic way of disseminating information about prevention is through education, as what I mentioned earlier, in particular value-based education, and also to embed it as a part of lifelong learning. We will try to promote and strengthen existing value-based education as a means of instilling respect for life, for diversity, and the values of tolerance, non-violence, mutual understanding, among others, so that we can work towards preventing violent extremism and other forms of violence. And the second point I would like to make here is that equally important is to promote the culture of prevention through the media, especially the new and social media. With regards to this, it's really about trying to counter the prevalence of online radicalization and other prurient forms of violence, like sexual, pornographic violence that you see online. And it is therefore very pivotal that we try to embed value-based messagings as we on social media and new media as well. And last but not least, I think raising awareness on the culture of prevention would also require relevant stakeholder engagement and participation, including at the grassroots levels, where communities are actively involved in the conversation against any forms of violence. And again, I will allude to the Doi Tong project, where we had a chance to meet with some of the youths and the elderlies and had that dialogue with them. And I think that such dialogue where you actually raise awareness among the participants and among the communities itself on the importance of preventing violence, by going upstream. And last but not least, I think one important thing that we should do is that we have to raise the culture of prevention mindshare, or mindsets, if you like, among the professionals. Example, the educators, the justice and health professionals, because they are actually being at the front line of engaging people at risk. So they are well positioned to mainstream the culture of prevention, in particular into their work practices, by promoting all these value-based messagings in their work with the people at risk. Likewise, one point I would like to also make is that the importance of the role of the private sector, the role of the CSOs and the academia as well in playing a part in trying to promote this culture of prevention. So let me just very quickly go into just the 2 thrusts. Thrust 2, which is with regards to promoting a culture of respect for all. Our primary aim is to prevent violence against women, children, youth, and other vulnerable groups from occurring in the first place, but through upstream measures. I will not go through all the examples there, but this is just to give you a flavor of some of the initiatives that we are developing. And perhaps I'll just want very quickly to just highlight on number 3, on the Youth Development Index. As what I mentioned earlier, there's a need to really understand the root causes. And one way to do this is really through evidence-based methodology. So for ASEAN itself, we have developed the first Youth Development Index. Currently, there are 4 indicators, and the indicators covered education, employment and opportunity, health and well-being, participation and engagement. So for example, for health and well-being, one of the key indicators that we are looking at is drug abuse. The other that we are looking at is adolescent fertility rate. So with these indicators, with this evidence-based approach that we are taking, it will provide us with more informed decisions on as we develop preventive policies and initiatives. So finally, my last slide here, it's the Trust Tree itself, which is promoting a culture of good governance at all levels. Primarily for this trust itself, we are looking at preventing crime, drug and corruption from occurring in the first place. That could include inculcating values of responsible citizenship, supporting equitable socio-economic development, among others. So one of the things that we want to do, and we would certainly like to partner UNODC, is they have a very successful program in Brazil in using sports to keep the people at risk, in particular the youths, from the streets. And we are hoping to work with them on that initiative. And also going back to the point that I was making earlier about the need for value-based messagings, the need for value-based education, I think that it's high time that, in schools itself, there's a need to promote anti-corruption literacy. Yeah. And on my third point there, going back to the point that I made earlier about poverty eradication, while it is very important, of course, to continue to fight poverty, we should be also going upstream to think about, how to prevent poverty by asking the question and addressing the answer as to, how poverty is being replicated and reproduced, and how we can address that issue. And then last but not least, we are also looking at, better governance program on anti-corruption, among others. So on this note, I would like to just say that for us in ASEAN itself, we welcome, respective private sectors and the academy, as well as civil societies, to work with us in promoting this cultural prevention, either through your own initiatives or through partnerships with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Mr. Tam, may I ask one question? Yeah.
We have only adopted the COP declaration in November last year, as I mentioned. So the next step is that, as we speak right now, we are actually developing a pipeline of initiatives that cut across all the sectoral bodies. We have about 15 sectoral bodies under the ASEAN Social Cultural Community Pillar. For those who are familiar, the areas cover from arts and culture to disaster management to environment, and then to education, health, gender equality. So what we are doing right now is that we are developing, as I said, a pipeline of initiatives. And the next step is that come March this year, the ministers under the social cultural community pillar will be coming together to deliberate on strategic issues relating to the culture of prevention. So what are the strategic issues? It will be issues like, where we should put the focus on identifying the root causes, who we should be partnering, how we should be engaging. So this will be some of the strategic issues that the ministers will actually be deliberating sometime in March this year. And with that, we'll set the strategic directions for ASEAN. And then in terms of collaboration with external partners and our dialogue partners, we will be having a partnership conference sometime in May this year where we would like very much to work with different partners in terms of not just about the funding of initiatives and all that, but also in terms of resource mobilization, in getting experts to help us to work on different aspects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask one question to Mr. Sagredo. And this one is, it is commonly understood that increased social development has wide-reaching positive outcomes, not just for crime prevention, but for the society at large. And in your contribution to the 5th International Report on Crime Prevention and Community Safety, you speak about anchoring drug policies in a human development paradigm. Can you unpack what this means for the application of these policies, specifically in relation to vulnerable communities?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because it was one of the elements of the presentation that I didn't have time to address. And I think it's been one of the most interesting approaches to drug policy that came out in the international discussion in the last few years, especially in the road to the UN General Assembly, Special General Assembly on Drugs that took place in 2016. I was working at UNDP at the time, and until that moment, the development community had many difficulties to engage in analyzing drug policy and drug policy impacts from a sustainable development approach. What we did is to put light in something that had never been overtaken by, I would say, the drug community or the drug policy community, which has always focused on what are the harms of drugs for society in terms of health, in terms of social impact, in terms of productivity, and also focused on what are the harms of illicit markets, also for society in terms of violence, corruption, etc. What we did is we put light in a third element that had always been overlooked, which is what is the impact of drug policy, what is the impact of the response of the states in sustainable development, what is the impact on the increasing of poverty, what is the impact in inequality, what is the impact on health, what is the impact on human rights, on women's empowerment, on the environment, on the economy, on the indigenous groups' rights. So we actually gave a whole look at the evidence generated already in this impact, and what we saw is a picture of I would say, very negative consequences for the sustainable development of communities, of many families, of many territories, and of many urban and rural areas that have been suffering, in a way, those, I would say, radical responses to the drug problem. That has framed the discussion also with the 2030 agenda. I think it's a fantastic political opportunity because all your countries have agreed upon this complex development agenda, and what we did is matched those inconsistencies of the responses on the drug field with the SDGs, and we saw an appalling picture that I think it's a fantastic way to engage with government, saying, you want to get the development results in 2030, we need to talk about this, because drug policy is affecting negatively the capacity of our countries to reach there, to reach those, and we need to take care of those negative consequences so we can reduce poverty, so we can address those left behind, which are the focus of the 2030 agenda. I think now is the time for stop discussing and for start doing things. I think these 3 days have been absolutely amazing in terms of looking at what are the results of development-led approaches to these issues. The Deutun experience, which is taken as a top world experience in terms of development results, I think it's something that has to be taken into consideration.